Functional theories of attitudes are great ways that help us explain why people hold the attitudes that they hold. It also looks at attitudes as a way to help people cope with life. They put a strong emphasis on primary benefits provided by various attitudes. So the attitudes that we hold produce benefits for us. And they also talk about how we can hold the same attitude for entirely different reasons. So the example in the book that they talk about is volunteering and why we might think volunteering is good or that we want to do it. But the reasons that we think that or do that are completely different. All right, so that's what the functional theories of attitudes tell us about. All right, so there are 6 functions of attitudes that we can use when thinking about how it is that we might want to go to persuade somebody, right? So the first function of attitudes is that of knowledge. And this is going to help people make sense of the world. And the most obvious sort of knowledge function is that of stereotypes, right? And stereotyping can be good or bad, right? Stereotyping in its basic form just helps us to make sense of the world. So that we're not constantly processing new information over and over and over again, right? Because if we did, we would never get anything done because we would have never experienced it before. We wouldn't know what to expect in certain situations and those sorts of things. However, of course, stereotypes can be very misleading, right? Especially when it comes to like individual people or individual situations. And so you have to take the information and good that comes from the stereotypes and also balance it with the fact that this particular situation, this particular person doesn't fall into that particular stereotype, right? So you might expect, you've taken an online class before, and so you have an expectation or a stereotype of what online classes are supposed to be. But maybe this class is not it, right? It's not the same thing, so you expected it to be something different than it was. And so that is something that where you have to kind of adjust that. So there's the knowledge function, okay? The second one is going to be utilitarian. So this function is designed to help us, basically, our attitudes help us to obtain rewards and avoid punishment, right? So if I don't want to go to jail, I have attitudes about avoiding illegal activity, like at, the highest regards, because the thought of, hanging out in a jail cell is not appealing to me, so I want to avoid that punishment. Or something like being nice and cooperative with your parents or some other authority figure, and that producing some sort of benefit, right? That would be utilitarian. A social adjustive is going to help us adjust to our reference group. So think of this as kind of trying to fit in, right? So when we want to be a part of a certain group, right? Maybe we want to be a part of a certain organization on campus or in high school or something like that. We're going to adopt a favorable attitude toward whatever it is that group is all about, okay? Social identity is the fourth main function, and this helps us communicate who we are and what we aspire to be. So this is really important in the marketing and advertising world. A lot of times they spend a lot of time trying to create an identity that people want to grab onto with regards to their products. And so you can think about like high-end cars or brand name clothing and why they might have celebrities endorse them and those sorts of things, right? So they're going to help people communicate who they are and what they aspire to. So you can think of them as like status symbols. So when people are advertising and marketing status symbols or lifestyle, that is going into the function of social identity. Or even the stickers that you put on your computers or that people used to put on their cars, jewelry you wear, that sort of stuff. Value expressive function is going to help people express core values and cherished beliefs. So if somebody was a vegan or pro-Second Amendment or very into green living or an exercise fanatic, right? They would express those core values and cherished beliefs in a variety of ways by the things that they did, things that they said, maybe their clothing, etc. And then the last one is the ego defensive. And this one serves as a defense against unpleasant emotions that people don't want to consciously acknowledge, and it shields them from psychologically uncomfortable truths. And so sometimes we don't even really know that this one is going on, but it is a function of attitudes. So in one study, they found that people that believe that the world is a fair place, they tend to blame victims of crimes for being victimized. So that belief is shielding them from what may actually be true, right? That would make them uncomfortable. And so the ego defensive one can be kind of difficult to get at. So what functional theory looks like with kind of in conjunction with persuasion is that it's going to suggest that a persuasive message is most likely to change an individual's attitude when the message is directed at the underlying function that the attitude serves. Okay, so messages that match the function served by an attitude should be more compelling than those that are not relevant to the function addressed by the attitude. So when researchers tested this, right, their results basically showed that we would be more motivated if messages targeted our own attitude function. So if you think about all of those 6 functions that we just discussed, right, if we can match the message to that function, right, we're much more likely, the message is much more likely to be persuasive than if it's mismatched. So if I was going to pick a utilitarian function, or somebody had a utilitarian function, I would want to create an ad that focused on that utilitarian function, right? But if I showed them an ad that was a value expressive function, that may not work, okay? And so that's basically what the studies were saying, is that to change an attitude, one must understand the function that it serves and then direct that message to the underlying function. So now we're going to start looking at the relationship between the attitudes and then the resulting behaviors, okay? So what research has found is that attitudes tend to predict behavior, but not always. And in fact, you may have experienced this before, where you believe that one person has attitudes favoring and opposing certain things, but then the way in which they act is completely contradictory, right? So attitudes tend to predict behavior, but not always. And so that's an important thing to kind of remember. We're trying to be able to predict the behavior, but we may not always be able to, because for whatever reason, right, and that's typically what researchers are trying to figure out, those aren't matching up for the person. And so in order to persuade those people, we have to kind of take a different approach. But generally speaking, there are 3 key moderators that we're looking at in order to predict the behavior from the attitude. The first is going to be the situational factors, and we're going to talk about each of these 3 in more detail here on the further slides. But the situational factors are going to be your norms, roles, and scripts. Your personal characteristics, this involves self-monitoring and direct experience. And then the third one is the quality of the attitude themselves. Is it a general attitude, or is it very specific? And what is the strength of the attitude? So the context or situation that we are in is going to exert a powerful impact on our behavior. So if we are in completely different situations, our behavior may change, right? If we're surrounded by different people, right? If we're at school versus at home, if we're at work versus, let's say, at a social gathering, right? All of these things are going to affect how it is that we act and the different attitudes that we may hold. Okay, so the context that we're in is going to definitely impact our behavior. And so the things that we look at in these situational factors are going to be the norms, so the beliefs about appropriate behavior in a given situation. So depending on the situation, there's appropriate behavior that we should be engaging in. So things like The social norm of politeness in class keeps us from criticizing a disliked teacher or classmates. It could be social norms of whether or not, like in movie theaters, you can talk. That also kind of goes to a script. But with norms, these can vary across cultures. So what is acceptable and appropriate in one culture may not be in another culture, right? And vice versa. So the norms change. And so we have to be aware of that when we are creating persuasive messages, because whatever the norm is in California may not be the norm in Texas, is likely not to be the norm in Japan, right? And so if we're doing some, we're creating different advertisements for different areas of the country, different areas of the world, you have to take those things into consideration. The second one is going to be our roles. So our roles are going to be the everyday functions that we play in our lives, right? So you're a child, you may be a parent, you are a friend, you're a student, you're probably an employee, whatever it is, but you are playing these various roles every day. And so this also affects our attitude behavior link, right? So depending on what role we're playing and what the norms are in a given situation, right? You can see how those are going to change. And then the scripts are going to be a set of expectations about an event or a sequence, right? So if you go into a face-to-face class, right, there's a script that follows. The teacher's in the front, the students sit in the seats. You take out your computer or notebook to take notes. You're listening to the professor talk while you're being quiet, and then when they want you to talk, you talk, right? And then when class is over, you get up and leave. And so that's the script. Or if you go to the movie theater, right, it's expected that you're going to be quiet, you're going to turn off your cell phone, etc., etc., etc. That's the script. So all those combined produce the situational factors that are going to influence the attitude-behavior relationship. The second factor in the attitude-behavior relationship is that of personal characteristics. So individuals will differ in the extent to which they display consistency between their attitudes and their behavior, right, like we were talking about before. So there are two moderating factors that influence that, and that's going to be your self-monitoring and direct experience, okay? So self-monitoring refers to the degree to which individuals are concerned with displaying appropriate behavior in social situations. And I'm sure that you have observed this amongst your family and friends. Some people are very acutely aware of what is appropriate behavior in social situations, and other people are not, right? And so your high self-monitors are going to monitor their public appearances of self that they display in social situations. Your low self-monitors are less concerned with fitting into a situation or displaying socially correct behavior. They're much more concerned about being true to who they are and those sorts of things, okay? So the low self-monitors are less concerned with fitting in and displaying that behavior, so they're going to have more attitude behavior consistency because they don't care as much about who's around or what situation they're in. They're going to have the same beliefs. They're not going to adjust to somebody else in order to make it more comfortable and those sorts of things. Your high self-monitors are going to exhibit that less attitude behavior consistency than low self-monitors because they're much more concerned about appearing appropriate and socially acceptable in these different situations. Another great way to look at high self-monitoring and low self-monitoring is what happens online or in social media interactions, right? So high self-monitors, they're going to be much more highly cognizant of how they come across in social media. They're going to strategize to brand themselves in more image-conscious ways. They want to be accepted by the broad audience typically that they're speaking to and those sorts of things. The low self-monitors will be less interested with self-branding and more concerned with maintaining consistency between their value expressive based attitudes and social media. So they're going to say whatever it is that they want to say, regardless if people like it or not, right? So if you were having trouble kind of thinking about it in a face-to-face interaction sort of way, the online one or social media one you can definitely probably relate with, because you have friends that probably behave in both ways. So another aspect of the personal characteristics is going to be that of our direct experience. So our attitudes are going to form through that we form through our direct experience are going to be much more clearly defined because we have experienced it, right? If we've never experienced it before, we're not going to have as strong of an attitude about it, right? They're going to be much more certain, they're going to be more stable, they're going to be resistant to change, and they're going to be easily accessible, right, through recall. And so therefore, those are going to be much more likely to predict behavior. So if somebody has a direct experience with it, right, their attitudes are likely to be much stronger, right? They're going to know what it is that they think, why they think it, and those sorts of things. And it's much more likely to predict what they will do. Last aspect of the quality or of the behavior attitude relationship is going to be that of the qualities of the attitude. So in this particular set, we're looking at the general versus specific attitudes. So our general attitudes are going to be global evaluations for multiple situations. So it could be attitudes towards a general object, right? Specific attitudes are going to be attitudes toward a behavior, right? Is going to be an evaluation of a single act or a specific behavior that's taking place in a particular context at a particular time. So the general attitude is unlikely to predict each and every behavior, right? They're also unlikely to predict specific behaviors. But they can predict a pattern of total behavior, a general pattern that one might engage in, all right? And specific attitudes are going to be able to predict specific behaviors, but not general behaviors, right? So the compatibility principle, which basically tells us that there is a strong relationship between attitude and behavior, is possible only if the attitudinal predictor corresponds with the behavioral criteria, right? So general attitudes predict those broad classes of behavior. They're going to cut across the different situations. Your specific attitudes toward a behavior are going to predict highly specific acts in specific situations. The attitude strength we're actually going to talk about on the next slide. So the attitude strength is going to basically tell us that strong attitudes are going to predict behavior better than weak attitudes, which makes a whole lot of sense, right? If we believe something more strongly, we're going to have a much more likelihood of performing that behavior than if we had a weak attitude, right? So it's going to provide a much more consistent link and a much more stronger ability to forecast behavior. If we're ambivalent about an issue, we're less apt to translate that attitude into behavior, right? So this is when ambivalence or affect or emotion comes into play if we don't really care that much about it, right? So if we're evaluating that attitude and it's not a strong, we don't feel strongly or whether it's good or bad, it's just kind of neutral or ambivalent, we don't really care. It's definitely not going to be, you're not going to be able to predict a behavior as much from that sort of attitude. So the stronger the attitude, the more likely you are to be able to predict the behavior. The reason action model is the first of the two major theories of attitude-behavior relations that we're going to talk about. It was originally proposed by Fishbein and Ashton in 1975. Ashton then extended it in 1991 in his planned behavior theory. And then since then it's been streamlined, clarified, and modified in 2010 to take into account new ideas. And so this is kind of the cool thing about theory, that starts off one way, and then over time, with people conducting studies over and over and over again, it gets refined and made even better. But the general purpose of the reason action model is that it offers the most systematic explanation in the field of the processes by which beliefs influence behavior. And as such, right, people will often use it in order to produce persuasive messages, especially if they're looking for logical ones. So in this particular reasoned action model, right, basically what we're trying to do is say that behavior can be predicted, but it's going to depend on people's attitudes, their propensity to please others, so those social norms, and then confidence that they can carry out their plans, or perceived behavioral control. And so it will help generate a series of very specific strategies that persuaders should employ to craft communications on any topic that you could possibly imagine that you might want to persuade somebody to do. The term reasoned action implies that people are rational and deliberate in how they go about deciding whether to perform a particular behavior. And that is very important, because when we talk about sort of the downfalls of the reasoned action model, which we'll get to later, we'll often realize that a lot of things that we do are not reasoned action, right? They're not logical. So keep that in mind. But if we're talking about a behavior that's going to be associated with a reasoned action, right, this model is excellent for predicting that. The reasoned action model is made up of 5 components, right? And so it's going to be the attitude toward the behavior, perceived norm, perceived behavioral control, the behavioral intention, and the behavior itself. So the attitude toward the behavior, basically, is it something that is good or bad to do, right? It's going to be a highly specific attitude, and it's made up of 2 subcomponents: our behavioral beliefs, so beliefs about what the consequence of the behavior is, and outcome evaluation, so the evaluation of the consequences. So in the example in the book, they give you a whole bunch of stuff about, and scales about texting and driving, and the models about texting and driving, which we'll see here in just a second. But so depending on what our beliefs about the consequences are, and then the evaluations of those consequences, will have a huge impact on whether we engage in that behavior or not. Secondly is going to be the perceived norm, the social pressure to do it, right? So the perceived social pressure to perform an action has 2 components: the injunctive norms and the descriptive norms. So the injunctive norms are going to be the perception of what other people think we should do. And so this is going to consist of the injunctive normative beliefs, or beliefs that individuals who are important to the other person endorse the behavior. So it could be their friends, it could be their parents, it could be the law, whatever it is. And then the second part is going to be that motivation to comply. Are they motivated to go along with what these important people in their life think that they should be doing? Sometimes that is no, right? And so that can make it more difficult. The descriptive norms are going to be perceptions of what others have done, are doing, or are likely to do in the future. So if you believe that, well, people text and drive all the time and it's no big deal, right? That is going to be problematic for if they're trying to persuade you otherwise. So your descriptive normative beliefs are beliefs about how frequently important others engage in the behavior. So are your friends texting and driving all the time, or your parents texting and driving all the time, right? And then the second aspect of that is going to be identification, the degree to which an individual identifies with those significant others. Do they seem to be similar to them? Right? Is that who they want to be? That sort of stuff. The third component is going to be that of perceived behavioral control. And this is going to be the individual's perception on how much control he or she has over the behavior. Do they have the skills or confidence to enact the behavior in a particular situation? So are they able to turn their phone off, set it to safe to save, or something like that that's going to prevent them from texting while driving. And so this perceived behavior control is a very important aspect of this model, because if somebody doesn't believe that they have the ability to do so, even if they want to change or want to engage in a behavior, If they don't think that they can, that's going to impact their behavior. The attitude and norm will more accurately predict intention when perceived behavioral control is added to the model. So we have the attitudes and the norms we just described, and then if we add that perceived behavioral control to the model and somebody feels confident in their ability to do it, they're much more likely to do it. You can think also like an exercise routine, right? If I feel like I have the skills or confidence to do it, then I'm much more likely to do it, right? I could really want to lose weight and get into great shape, but if I've never done that before, if I've never worked out before, let's say I want to join something like CrossFit, but I'm not really all that athletically inclined, right? I may not have the confidence or skills to really make that a part of my daily regimen, right? So that perceived behavioral control is going to be a very important component on whether or not they're able to perform the behavior. The fourth aspect will be the behavioral intention. So the intention to perform a particular action or a plan to put the behavior into place, right? So if we believe we have control, we develop a plan to put it into, to put the behavior into place. And then the last aspect, of course, is going to be the behavior itself. So the intention to perform a particular behavior should predict the actual performance of the act. So those are the 5 components of the reason action model. And if you look at the chart in the next slide, they give you that example for texting and driving, but you can think of any other sort of behavior, right, you would want people to engage in or not engage in, and substitute those in those different areas. So there are, of course, with every theoretical model, going to be shortcomings or faults with it as well. And the biggest one that I have always had with the reason action model is that it assumes that human beings are logical, and that their behaviors are going to correspond to logical thought. Okay, and some of them do, but a lot of them don't. And so when the behavior is much more spontaneous or even impulsive, and once again, this is going to depend a lot on the person. If they're governed more by logic or more by emotion, this could be more indicative of another. But let's go back to the exercise option, right? So we've got a plan. We want to do it. We believe we've got the skills to do it. Great. We're going to exercise 4 days a week. And then I wake up one of the mornings I'm going to exercise and I just don't feel like it, right? Or somebody came up with a great fun activity that I'd much rather do than exercise, right? So logically speaking, it all makes sense, and this is what I should engage in. I should go do my exercise routine because that's what I said I was going to do. But, right, if something comes up or I don't feel like it or whatever it is, I'm in a bad mood, maybe I just don't want to work out, that can have a stronger influence on my behavior, right, than my logical reason that I'd come up with before in order to start the behavior. So that can be a big challenge of forecasting intentions and behavior when attitudes are going to be irrational or implicitly held as well, or those emotions or affect are influencing that behavior too. So those are the biggest sort of downfalls of the reason action model, is that it is basing it all on logic, right, on logical thought process, which for some things are going to be very important, right, and even emotion can account into some of that, but they're the biggest downfalls of this model that have to be taken into account in other ways. The second major theory that we look at with attitude-behavior relationships is that of accessibility theory, which we also talked about in Chapter 4. So in accessibility theory, attitudes will predict behavior if they can be activated from memory at the moment of decision. So if we're in touch with our attitudes, we'll act on them. If not, we won't. So you've got your 2 core requirements for accessibility theory, right? The attitude must be activated from memory. The attitude must influence our perceptions of the issue. So we need it to definitely spontaneously come to mind, right? and it must also influence our perceptions of the issue person, serving as a filter through which that issue or person is going to be viewed. All right, so that's the basis of accessibility theory. So what have both of the models taught us in regards to persuasion and what we're supposed to do with them in order to get people to perform the things that we want them to perform, right? So here we have our lessons learned from both models, right? So when we go about designing a persuasive message to get people to change their mind, to perform a behavior, etc., the reason action model has given us 4 of the 6, or yes, 4 of the 7 it looks like that we have here. And then accessibility theory gives us the other 3. So the reason action model basically tells us to target relevant beliefs, to target the outcome evaluations, to appeal to social norms, and to target perceived behavioral control. Accessibility theory tells us that we can change attitudes through association techniques, because remember, we're assessing things from memory. To put people in touch with their feelings, so this is where more of that emotive affect comes in, and to start when they are young. So if you can associate things with them when they are young, they're much more likely to hold on to those because they're going to be in their subconscious and they're going to be able to attend to them if they've seen it over and over again. So, and this is why there's all kinds of controversy about advertising to children and what sorts of things you can advertise to children and all of that. Like back, I want to say in probably like the 80s or 90s, they really put a strong limit on where cigarette advertisements could be placed, right? So you could, it was no longer allowed eventually to be in movies, especially if it was like PG-13 and below. You couldn't advertise on billboards or magazines or television that children might see, right? So there's all of this sort of stuff to protect children from, basically, that they were using accessibility theory, saying that if they're exposed to it when they're young, the cigarette commercials were, right, then they might grow up to smoke, right? Because they'll be able to assess, be able to rely on that memory of what they thought looked cool or whatever it was. So accessibility theory is relying on that aspect. So when you're thinking about your video project, which we're actually going to talk about on the next slide a little bit here, or other advertisements that you're viewing or those sorts of things, right? Think about these different persuasive messages. What are they trying to do to get you to like their product, buy their product, engage in this behavior, not engage in this behavior, sort of stuff, okay? So to kind of get your brain sort of working on your video project collaboration assignment, right, what I want you to do is in your group folder that you've already created, you're going to create a Google document in it. And the first thing I want you to do is indicate which video project your group's going to be doing, right? Are you going to be creating an advertisement, or are you going to analyze several already produced advertisements? That's the first thing, right? Then I want you to pick 3 of the 6 or 7 persuasive tactics from the previous slide and define the tactic, and then define a message strategy to convince college students not to engage in underage drinking. All right, so you want to define the tactic, then you want to define the message strategy that you would use to convince them not to do so. All right, so what elements do you need to focus on? You might even want to consider the functions of attitudes at the beginning, right, with self-identification, ego defenses, and those sorts of things. And then how would you execute the message strategy? How would you do that, right? And so this is just simply a practice activity for what you're going to be doing in your video project, whether you're creating an advertisement or analyzing the advertisements, either way. It's not, there is no necessarily like absolutely right or wrong answer when it comes to this, because it is an analysis of what you think that is going on here, right? There are things that are going to be more correct than others, of course. But the point is to start thinking about it and to start kind of crafting your messages. and being able to see what's going on in different ways, or creating them yourself. So this is going to be practice for your big video project that will come up at the end. But I do want the group to complete it by Sunday, February 18th, by 11:59 p.m., right? And so if your document is not in there, right, then 5 points will be taken off of your video project if it's not done by that due date. So just make sure that you work together with your group and come up with, some persuasive tactics that you might use that you think would be effective in a campaign against underage drinking in college.